In this final unit, we are going to see some applied use of dynamical systems concepts in modeling various aspects of human physiology, behavior, and so on, and coordination particularly. We're going to look at three examples, and they're not all from the same school. They don't all share the same worldview. And that's quite typical. The language of dynamical systems is finding application in very many ways within cognitive science, leading to a diversity of approaches. So when you learn that some work is couched in the language of dynamical systems, that doesn't inform you terribly well about what the work is concerned with or what its stance is with respect to the person or the body. But these three particular examples have been carefully chosen, not only for diversity, but also because they have been very, very influential. And they show us ways in which the employment of the concepts of dynamical systems gives you a very novel perspective into aspects of human living that would not otherwise be available and certainly not manipulable using formal tools. So the first field we're going to look at is the field of coordination dynamics. This is essentially founded by this chap, Scott Kelso. He was from Derry. He was an Irishman, still active. His work has been summed up in two books. In 1995, Dynamic Patterns came out, and that illustrated a body of work done over 10, 12 years, which established the basic paradigm of coordination dynamics. Coordination dynamics became extremely influential, has been developed in very many ways, and it led to a second book about 2002, I think, called A Complementary Nature, together with David Engstrom. This is a much more, in some respects, much more profound and less formal book, in which the figures of thought underlying the approach of coordination dynamics are seen to be in tension to some extent with the manner in which the person, the mind, the brain, the body have been constructed within such disciplines as cognitive psychology. And it points instead to parallels between the figures of this work as they are being explicated and some elements in largely Eastern philosophies and Taoism particularly, which might come as a surprise. The seminal work that kicked off this field was a collaboration between Scott Kelso and Hermann Haken, who's a physicist in Stuttgart. I think he's still alive, but he's very old. Hermann Haken was one of the guys who developed the laser. The laser, as you know, was a significant breakthrough in physical theory. It required a certain innovation in mathematical modeling to model the coherent state of light within a laser. And it was there that from this physical source that the concepts were drawn, which were in this collaboration applied to a completely different field. They published a model in 1985 in a journal called Biological Cybernetics. We'll meet this model. It's called the Haken-Kelso-Bunce model, HKB. And that one paper in 1985 kicked off the field. And since then, there's been very, very, very many others. Scott has run a laboratory in the Center for Complex Systems in Florida Atlantic University for a long, long time now. And that has been a very productive laboratory with lots of postdocs, PhD researchers, collaborations, and has seeded work across the globe. You can get a flavor for this before we meet the HKB model directly. It's nice to see where Scott's head was coming from as he embarked on this very strange collaboration with a physicist. And you can get a sense for what was in his mind from this 1979 experimental paper, which he published in the journal Science. What he was looking at was the coordination of the limbs and the manner in which paired limbs, so 2 hands, 2 arms, 2 fingers, 2 toes, 2 wings, paired limbs exhibit a mutual coordination. They don't act either independently of one another or non-independently of one another. Rather, they display a specific kind of mutuality, of non-independence, that is brought into being when they are wielded in the service of a particular task. So I can do all kinds of things with my hand. I can keep this here, and this hand is entirely independent. But if my hands collaborate on a task, they become mutual. They become entrained in some fashion. So this was an initial foray into this object of study, and the diagram on the screen illustrates the result of an experiment, which I will walk you through. We'll go through this data plot line by line. It's very simple. In the experiment, subjects sat at a desk and they had their two fingers on two home keys. And at the sound of the bell or something like that, they were instructed to move either one or both fingers to targets which were either nearby and big or far away and little. There's a lot of choices there, giving rise to lots of experimental conditions, but each trial goes like this. Your fingers are on the home keys. Ding! You move the selected combination of fingers to the selected combination of targets, and the time is recorded from the bell to the landing of the finger on the target. Now that time itself is made up of two pieces. There's an invariant reaction time of about 1/4 of a second. That's just the time it takes for you to get off your ass and do something. And the flight time then from when the finger leaves the home key and lands on the target. That's the variable of interest. How long does it take? And this experiment was designed very carefully with lots of pilot work to ensure that the precise distances and sizes of the targets gave rise to figures that were readily interpretable. So as we go along, I'm going to simplify the figures that are on the diagram here. You can see some very precise figures there in milliseconds. But I'm going to simplify them to draw out only two numbers. First of all, we're going to walk through these lines. On the first line, there's two home keys, and you can see that on this trial, only the right hand is moving, and it's moving to the small distance target labeled 1. So that's right hand only going to the small distance target. And the number of interest here is given as 159, and I'm going to simplify that to 160 milliseconds. So that's the length of time taken for one hand to the distant target. The second line shows the same thing repeated on the left, and although the actual time recorded, 151 milliseconds, is slightly different, I'm going to still call that 160 milliseconds because there's a pattern that emerges I want you to see. So it's 160 milliseconds going to the right and 160 milliseconds going to the left. The next two lines, lines 3 and 4, show the same procedure where one hand moves to the large nearby target. And the headline figure here is 80 milliseconds, half of that for the distant target. So moving one hand to the large target on either side takes 80 milliseconds. So those first four lines were all single-handed movement. What does it matter if we move two hands at the same time? Well, lines 5 and 6 show you moving to the, first of all, the nearby easy targets, and the answer is again 80 milliseconds. And then moving two fingers to the distant small targets, and the answer is again 160 milliseconds. This is the invariance. Whether it's one hand or two, on the right or on the left, the easy targets take 80 milliseconds and the distant targets take twice that, 160 milliseconds. The only interesting conditions here are the last two, where we mix one easy target with one difficult target. We do that in two ways, one time with the easy target on the right, one time with the easy target on the left. And the key finding is that the distance traveled is about 160 milliseconds, irrespective of whether we're going to the easy target or the hard target. So under these conditions where the two hands are going to different kinds of targets, it's the more difficult target that seems to determine the amount of time taken to get to the easy target. Here are some recordings of hand position, speed, and acceleration. Position, on top, you can see this for the two hands. This is one of those trials with a mixture of a difficult and an easy target. And you can see the hands leaving the home keys and moving a short distance to the easy target, and a long distance to the hard target. The speed or velocity is the first derivative of this, and that's a smooth hump-shaped function, so you reach maximum velocity in the middle of the trajectory, and your velocity is 0 at the start and at the end. And you can see the two velocity curves are very similar. You can see that the fingers reach their target at the same time and that the peak velocity is reached at the same time. Acceleration is the first derivative of this. Acceleration first rises, then reaches 0, then drops, and then reaches 0 again, because you have to accelerate to reach peak speed and then decelerate. But once more, you can see that the two hands are absolutely non-independent. Not only do they leave and arrive at the same time, peak acceleration is reached at the same time, peak deceleration is reached at the same time. And so this simple experiment has demonstrated that the two hands are functionally yoked together in the service of this task. When I say functionally yoked together, I mean that to contrast with the mechanical yoking. They're not bound irrevocably to each other. The non-independence seen between the limbs here arises in the context of a specific task which has been designed by the experimenter. The importance of this insight is to push back against very problematic and very widespread views of the brain as controlling movement. The brain is popularly understood and entirely mistakenly understood to act as a controller issuing commands to muscles. This has been a default assumption by those who know nothing about the field, but it is unfortunately very, very widespread. What this demonstrates becomes a central insight of coordination dynamics, which is that the brain produces simultaneity of action, not by controlling each limb independently, but by organizing groups of muscles, functional groups of muscles, that is, ones that serve the purposes of the present task, that are then constrained to act as a single unit. And the keynote here is constraint rather than control. It's an entirely different role for the brain. So that initial little experiment sets us up then for understanding the model system that was developed in the Haken-Kelso-Bunce model, which we'll go to in the next video.